Pronouns he, him. I hope we have a fun and engaging debate. Speech will start in 3, 2, and 1. 3 things I'm going to do in my speech. Firstly, give you the context of this round and the trade-off on proposition. Secondly, show why the breaking of the structural power of gangs is necessary to restore the authority of the state. But thirdly, explaining why restoring state authority is essential to protect the basic rights of citizens and freedom for millions of ordinary citizens who were previously living under gang domination. We think this debate must be understood in the context of severe security crisis that El Salvador faced before these policies. For many years, powerful gangs such as Barrel 18 or something controlled very large parts of society, i.e. they extorted businesses and forced young people into gangs. We think in many communities, people could not travel freely or cooperate with the police without risking retaliation. And in practice, gangs are not the government. They control daily life for millions of people and kept them living without freedom. We believe that when criminal organizations reach this level of power, the state is no longer dealing with ordinary crime. Instead, it faces a situation where violent groups have begun to replace the authority of the government themselves. The government is failing in its most basic responsibility, and that is protecting the very citizens that contribute to the country. For that reason, the question in this debate is not whether these policies are perfect or not. Opposition will focus heavily on the risk of abuse, especially the concern that mass arrest could allow the government to detain people without full questioning or due process. But while this concern is important, we think it just misses the comparison in this debate. The comparison in this debate is not between the perfect democracy and this policy. Instead, it is between two very realistic words panel. In opposition's world, the government continues to rely on very slow and traditional policing methods that had already failed for decades, while gangs continue to terrorize communities and maintain territorial control. This means that the policy on our side of the house is the last choice available. I think at the core of this debate, it is the trade-off between two types of harm. We think on one side, these anti-gang measures involve emergency powers and large-scale arrests, which may create risks such as wrongful detention or abuse of power. On the other side, we think on their side, the situation before these policies was a society where gangs dominated neighborhoods and used violence to maintain control over communities. Therefore, we believe the harms on their side of the house are far larger and more widespread. Under gang domination, millions of people have lost their basic freedom every day, and we believe that this is the prerequisite for a better society, the prerequisite for anything to grow, the prerequisite for the economy to grow, because the status quo right now in El Salvador is that young people are forced in gangs simply to survive. We think additionally, the harms on our side of the house are significantly more limited than opposition suggests. First, for 3 reasons. A, these policies primarily target very well-known gang networks that have very long histories and documented histories about organized violence, meaning that enforcement is not completely random, but based on existing intelligence about gang members and territories. But secondly, these measures are emergency responses to an extreme security crisis rather than these permanent replacements for normal legal systems. Thirdly, even if mistakes occur, they can be later corrected through legal review once the stability is restored on our side of the house. But by contrast, the more violence and the more murder and the coercion caused by gang domination are more immediate and irreversible on their side of the house. But what's the principle on our side? We think most importantly, security is the foundation for justice. When gangs control society, courts cannot function. Witnesses are too afraid to testify. By weakening gangs first, we create the conditions for institutions and for accountability to function again. For that reason, we believe when organized criminal groups already have overwhelmed normal law enforcement and have taken control of society, strong anti-gang measures are justified. Why does the state have a duty to act on our side of the house? We think on a fundamental layer, the most basic responsibility of any government is to protect the safety and the security of the citizens. People give the state the authority, the power, and the control over institutions like the police and military and courts because they expect the state to protect them from violence and maintain order in society. When gangs dominate the communities and use violence to control daily life, we think the state is failing in this basic duty. Citizens cannot safely run their businesses and travel between the neighborhoods, and international visitors cannot even come in. In this situation, the government is no longer fulfilling its role. And this is a principle you have to weigh on in this debate to see which side wins. And it's obviously us, a panel. Because if the state chooses to not act decisively, the consequences are very severe. A bit of visualization here. We saw that gangs will continue to expand their control over territory and communities, and extortion systems will grow even stronger because there's enforcing more people under physical and financial threats. And young people will be increasingly recruited into gangs because they see no alternative path for the survival or protection. There's less trust in the government overall, and over time, we believe this becomes a cycle where criminal organizations become more powerful when the authority of the state becomes weaker, i.e., this means society reaches a point where the government no longer has meaningful control over parts of the country. When that happens, institutions such as courts and police are constantly threatened by violence. And in other words, if the state does not act to restore order, it risks allowing these criminal organizations to permanently replace the rule of law, to permanently replace the government in decision making and policy making. For that reason, we believe it is justified when gangs reach a level of power where they threaten the basic safety of society. Government not only has the right to intervene strongly, it has the duty to do so. Our principal argument in this debate on proposition is restoring state authority and protecting the rights of these citizens. The first and most important reason to support these measures is that they are necessary to break the structural power of gangs and restore the authority of the state and protect the basic right of ordinary citizens. We see the key problem in El Salvador here, a bit of framing. It's not just simply high crime. The fact that gangs have become very deeply organized institutions that control territory and communities, i.e. groups such as MS-13 and Bureau 18 operated through these large networks with leaders, enforcers, and recruiters or extortion systems. Because of this structure, we believe that traditional policy methods such as law investigations and individual arrests are very largely ineffective. We think the opposition must give us a good counterfactual in this debate to show why this can also happen on their side of the house, i.e., we think that gang members could warn each other about police, hide evidence on their side of the house before authorities were able to act. As a result, this is a failure of the state, and many communities were effectively governed by gangs rather than by the state. We think that these policies disrupt the network by removing large number of gang members at the same time. When thousands of members are arrested simultaneously, the internal structure of the gang begins to collapse, i.e., leaders lose communication with their members, and extortion systems are able to weaken. At the same time, the increased presence of police and military forces allow the government to physically reclaim the areas that were previously controlled by gangs. But we think that restoring state authority in these areas has very basic and very extremely important impacts for ordinary citizens. Because under gang rule, people lose their most basic freedoms. Businesses must pay extortion simply to survive, and families are threatened. In many communities, even moving between the neighborhoods or speaking to the police can put someone's life in danger. So we say the situation right now is very dire. When the government regains control of these areas, communities are no longer governed by fear and intimidation. Businesses can operate, and citizens regain trust in their government that the state is capable of protecting them and enforcing the rule of law. Therefore, we believe that breaking the power of gangs does not simply reduce crime, it restores the basic freedom and the rights of millions of ordinary people who were previously living under this constant threat. Without first dismantling these gang structures, none of these improvements would be possible. We are the prerequisite for opposition's entire case in this debate panel. And for that reason, strong anti-gang measures are inherently necessary to restore both the state authority and the fundamental right of citizens. Proud to propose.
Thank the first speaker of opposition for the speech. To respond to case, calling the first speaker of opposition.
Hello, yes. Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are audible and visible.
Right. Thank you. So I will be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Well, throughout this debate, we have seen one thing time and time again from the side proposition. What we have seen is that they failed to look at this motion from that holistic perspective, and they're mainly focusing on its policies. But one thing that they really ignore is that the emergency powers that have been granted to Nayib Bukele's government is to suspend human rights. And one of those human rights, as said in the info slide, is to suspend the right to assembly. Now, we are here in side opposition to prove that Nayib Bukele's anti-gang measures and state of emergency powers are not justified and non-sustainable to the people of El Salvador. Whereas for proposition, they would have to prove that these measures and the emergency state powers are justified and are sustainable. So, the key stakeholder of this debate that we wish to cater to is to the people of El Salvador. And these are the people who have to endure Nayib Bukele's anti-gang measures. And the thing is, they have to live in fear, whether they are involved in gang violence or not, as the thing is, these stricter measures take away human rights due to their emergency powers. Now, as a little bit of framing, we need to acknowledge that gang violence is a serious problem, but that doesn't mean that they should just kill off all the gangs. They need to solve this problem from the root cause. I'll explain why just killing everyone off is not the right way to go. Now, as we have a definition for what anti-gang measures are, these are measures such as suspending human rights, tougher prison sentences, etc. And these things are to so-called solve the crime issues that are going on there. And a bit of characterization is that the root cause of gang violence are things such as inequality, corruption, This all fosters an unhappy population with a lack of economic opportunities. And one of the main things this causes is poverty, a poorer population. Now, an unhappy population which is relatively poorer and treated as a lower class towards others leads to revolts. These revolts are what is in the form of gang violence. So, this is what causes gang violence, as I said earlier. And a populace that is resentful towards their government, that because the government doesn't suit their needs. Therefore, the government needs to solve it from the root cause, not like what side proposition are doing, which is to go in a shortcut route to just kill them all off. Now, as I said earlier, we do not support this gang violence, but we believe we should tackle it from the root cause of gang violence, which is less radical, unlike proposition, which intend to eliminate them with these policies. Now, a bit on to my argument. So, as a team split, I, as the first speaker on opposition, will be explaining how that proposition failed to solve the root causes of gang violence. My second speaker will talk about how these policies sacrifice the fundamentals of human rights and how they create an unchecked amount of government power. And my whip will finally summarize our case for today. Now, the thing, a bit of a rebuttal from what the proposition had stated was that they would like to restore the state authority to protect the civilians. But I have a question, and my question is simple. In the process of restoring authority, there will be a lot of battles between gangs and also between the government, especially the soldiers and the armies. So the question is simple. What about the collateral damage to the innocent people? In these gang fights between the gangs and the police or the army, people are obviously going to be dying, a lot of people. And this is going to cause the loss of so much innocent life. And a loss of so much innocent life is going to lead to, first of all, more people growing even more resentful. And even though the government can say, oh, this is to solve crime, remember, just because you're solving crime this way doesn't mean it's always the right way. The shortest way is not always the correct way. So,
POI.
POI accepted.
We acknowledge that any large-scale security policy can create some level of collateral harm, but the important comparison in this debate is which world creates more harm overall. Please engage.
All right. So right now, you're basically undermining the problem of collateral damage. That is the issue. So I'll explain further into my argument, which is on failing to solve the root cause of gang violence. Now, the problem with this case is not whether we should punish these gang members or not. They should be punished, yes, but it's about the right to use these gang violences as an excuse to take away and suspend human rights. Now, why do we want to implement such measures if you aren't addressing the root cause? Because the root cause is always the reason why things occur. And the thing is, killing off these gang members isn't solving the root of the problem. Basically, you're putting a band-aid over a wound that is so much bigger. You're undermining it. Now, the thing is, it goes in a procedure like this. Gang violence happens when gang violence happens, the government cracks down on crime. Now, the thing is, both gangs and the innocents are affected. Why? Because they're going to be fighting. The gangs are going to be fighting with the government, and the government is going to be killing off the members of the gangs. This would obviously lead to more innocents being killed off. Now, the thing is, once this gang violence is being cracked down upon, once gang violence is being cracked down upon, people will revolt due to the killing of all these innocent people. And I think these governments will silence the people because no right to assembly. It's already mentioned in the info slide. When there's no right to assembly, people will do more killings, and people will live in fear, and the innocents are going to be still stuck in poverty with no rights at the end of the day. Now, the solution. Instead of focusing all of the resources on punishing the people when the damage has already been done, we should prioritize looking to the root cause of the problem. I'll take it later. So, two things that caused the problems from earlier. First of all, poverty and the lack of opportunities and a weak government policies. Now, if these two subjects are addressed and solved and prioritized in the first place, gang violence wouldn't even have such a big issue in the first place. But now, for example, underfunding the police, corruption, etc. Now, the reason why gangs didn't come to this is because, as I said earlier, inequality, lack of economic opportunities, poverty, weak education and social systems as well, and a weak state institutions. And the thing is, gang violence isn't a born battle, it is manufactured, it is created, founded by a corrupt and broken system. But before that, I'll take your POIS. Okay, I'll continue on. So, how do we solve this problem? We solve this problem by improving economic stability and prioritizing employment, not by killing off the gangs. Because I said earlier, killing off the gangs will create more resentment. More resentment means that people are angry, people are more living more in fear. And a populace that lives in fear is not going to be able to work with productivity. Now, these people didn't just start out as gang members. They turned to gang violence because of poverty and lack of institutions. They want to help their families. Now, I'm not saying that gang violence is good. I'm saying that the gangs, they're trying to do this to have more money, to solve their own personal issues. And that's why the government should help fund, not fund the gangs, but help subsidize these people. Not the gangs again, but the people of El Salvador need to have more support from the government. Not by killing off the gangs, but by helping the people in general to live a life in a higher quality of life. Now, this is just the reality panel. Now, finally, as a conclusion, focusing on things like employment would not only help the society in El Salvador, but also economic growth, because there'll be more employment, more goods produced locally, more productivity, economic growth, and then there'll be more gain in revenue. This will lead to be a more stable economy due to the financing of proper institutions and paying the working class more fairly compared to propositions world. So what have we proven today, panel? We have proven to you that failing to solve the root causes of gang violence will cause even more problems. This is what proposition is advocating for. That they should not solve the root problem, rather they should take the shortest route to solving the problem, that being to kill off the gangs. And due to this, I have never been prouder to oppose and reject this motion, panel. Thank you very much.
I thank the first speaker of opposition for the speech. Now to respond to the case, calling the second speaker of proposition.
Wait, give me like 10 seconds to get water.
Yep, sure.
Okay, hold up. Let me set up my timer real quick. Okay, pronounce she, her, POI verbally, assuming that I'm audible. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. First of all, I'm going to start with the rebuttal to attack the premises that that LO has been pretty contingent throughout his speech. But then moving on, I'm just going to give you an extension about why we think the trade-off is worth it and what is symmetrical on both of the house and why is the comparative here is way worse under their side. And last of all, I want to extend on the magnitude and the impact about why or how we're able to manifest a crime reduction and what is a fundamental net good under our side. First of all, when the contingent they taught, when the premises they brought up to you in LO, are mainly a few arguments. The first argument they told you about is like how we directly ignore the root causes of gang violence. Therefore, we create more opportunities for these gang members to thrive because of like the root causes like poverty and social inequality, etc. Those under our side, we believe that those causes exist, but the problem here is they cannot be solved until the state regain control. I want to explain or rebut against this premise or argument on 3 layers. The first layer, so I think that even if you were to be able to allocate all of your funding and your money into education, for example, or like social inequality in education will not work under the very fact that you still have gang violence across the road. For example, you cannot walk to school if you were scared that a gang member might appear in front of you and recruit you to their teams for you to kill people as well. Therefore, without having any stability in the first place, you cannot simply afford education or a walk to school in the first place because these education or these like root causes like solving social injustice is directly contingent or conditioned on the fact that you have stability in the first place. But second of all, I want to talk about how this alternative takes a very long time because because if you were to implement an academic system, for example, or like a more stronger like extent of like quotas toward like how you allow women to work, for example, all of these implementation of like academic progress will take a lot of years. For example, you were to like even if you were able to adopt an academic system, it would have taken 10 years to 20 years for the effects to actually show up. But in this 10 to 20 years, gang members might have already conquered the entire nation itself because you don't really have any territorial power against these gang members. This is way worse in itself that actually allow these gang members to have an opportunity to kill more people and to actually dominate the nation. But last of all, I want to talk about the state capacity, because then in the status quo, because El Salvador is currently suffering with like an immense exaggeration of like gang violence, not just a simple gang violence, we think that the trade-off here is very clear, because in the status quo, even police and institutions and criminal justice system are intimidated. This is why it's so hard in the first place to solve gang violence with soft powers without any hard power against them. But then second of all, they talk about how when innocents are being killed, or when you have mass arrests, for example, when you kill a gang member, you also mistakenly kill innocent people. But then first of all, take a look at this in the status quo under their side. Gang members constantly intimidate witnesses in the first place, and the CGS basically doesn't really work in the first place because they are always intimidated by these gang members because they constantly receive threats from these gang members. So I think at the end of the day, the innocents are not really being protected under their side in any ways. But then what are symmetrical on both sides of the house? I think first of all, human rights are constantly being violated on both sides as well. The lives of millions of individuals are constantly traded off as well as both sides. But the comparison on this side is way worse when like gang members are able to have a better territorial power against the governments, which means that the governments cannot be functional anymore to support its citizens. But then second of all, even in the worst case scenario that the corruption happens and like Bukele becomes a dictator, corruption will happen under their side as well on their case, because if the state don't have enough power against or over the gang member, the gang member are likely to be the one that actually overtake the entire nation, which is repeat the same case with Afghanistan, which is comparatively much more worse and more likely to happen in the first place on their side and on their solution. But then on our side, we believe that only when gang violence is solved, only then when gang violence are solved, then reform like democracy, for example, will actually happen. Because even if you do have the quote-unquote democracy under their side, it's not really true democracy when you're constantly living in fear, and when you're constantly living in fear where your children might be recruited toward a gang member, like a gang system, for example. But then we also want to talk about how soft powers, like soft solution on their side, like giving funding toward an academic system or having so-called reform, does not work under their side. Because soft powers like negotiating, for example, in the first place will not work because these gang members are armed, they have weapons, and they organize like a military. So in order for you to retaliate and to actually disrupt the criminal network, the state must escalate their force with like military/police powers or mass arrest, even though that might risk innocent life, for example. We are willing to do this trade-off because we cannot afford the alternative of gang members being more powerful than the government itself, which leads to the functionality of the governments to fall apart and letting the gang members to overtake. But then before I move on to the POI.
So if you are a citizen in El Salvador, would you mind if your human right to freedom of speech is no more existing?
Okay, when I am constantly living in fear that I can't walk next to my neighbor house without a gang member might murder me by then, I would still agree with the fact that the governments might provide me a better security, even that might sacrifice a few of my human rights. Because in the first place already, my human rights are constantly being violated by these gang members in the first place already. Therefore, I have no other alternative or chances to rather than to agree and opt into the kind of system that the government will provide to me. Because at the very least, I'm able to make sure that I will be able to walk safely across the street, for example, which is a net good under our side. But then how are we able to manifest a crime reduction under our side? And by then, how are we able to turn their argument about how stability happens and you're able to have a good economics under their side. So how are able to manifest these things? First of all, the mechanism is really simple here, and my first speaker had done a great job to explain this already. Because of mass arrest, even if you were to trade off a few innocents' life or a few innocent suspicion, at the very least, when it's still under a constitution power, for example, at least we're able to actually have these institutions to be functional in the first place, right? But then second of all, crime, homicide rates, or murder rates, for example, or gang violence related crimes will likely to be decreased because of these kind of like mass police force or like military force against them, for example, and this escalation of power with the state being provided, right? Because by then we're able to achieve a true democracy, good economic and development that are prerequisite condition onto the stability of the whole country, which is a fundamental net good under our side. But this is the only way that we can adopt a social and functional society, because without having stability for you, children cannot walk to school to actually have enough education at the end of the day. People cannot actually work or be a productive workforce, or can actually go to their work and actually to like open their business without paying for gang taxes, for example. Which is why in the first place, gang members cannot be an excuse to work whatever they're doing just because they live up with poverty, for example. We think because of that, the only reason for you to be able to build up or create reform in the first place throughout a nation is to achieve stability within the nation. Because on their side, they exaggerate their policies about how you're able to have fewer arrests. But like I said already, fewer arrests does not work when you're constantly being threatened by gang members, for example. I'll have proven to you that why we think that the only way for you to actually narrow the path down to a greater nation is through the Bakule what he did. So with all this case present to you, Prof.
I thank the second speaker of opposition for this speech. To respond to case, calling the second speaker of opposition.
All right, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I prefer verbal POIs. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we understand that gang violence is a big topic and a serious problem in El Salvador in today's world. However, the question, panel, in today's debate is, are the ways of Nayib Bukele sustainable and safe, or is it just an excuse to violate these basic decency human rights? Now, we do not agree with gang violence and the idea of it. We are just going against the idea of how the problem is being solved. Now, I'll be tackling some rebuttals before heading on to my arguments in today's case. First, government said that the basic purpose and job of the government is to protect civilians from these crimes, and they keep going on and on about how their human rights have already been violated with these gangs walking the street and how they do not feel safe. However, something that they failed to realize is that the government already failed to do that, which is why we're even here in the first place. If they had things under control and didn't underpay security or police or these things, we wouldn't have come to this situation in the first place. Neither would Nayib Bukele wouldn't even have to come in and have mass incarceration happen if the situation was already controlled in the first place. Two things in today's debate. Number one, policies can violate human rights. Number two, unchecked government power. Now, first be expanding on my first argument. Innocent people are being punished for even limited involvement, such as being in the area during the time of the crime, or even as something as simple as having the same tattoos or the same type of tattoos can even get them incarcerated. It is clear to us that Nayib Bukele wants to reduce gang violence. There is no question in that. But instead, he is bringing fear upon his civilians, bringing people who have no involvement at all into places of such abomination. Every human deserves rights. Otherwise, El Salvador is just another USA. In truth, we would never know what truly goes on in someone's life. They could be innocent. They could have absolutely nothing to do with these gang members. But with the measures taken by Nayib Bukele, their life could be turned into a 360 for the worst. Furthermore, rights protect civilians from the abuse of power, the abuse of government power where they try to take your rights away, silencing people. Removing their rights of even defending themselves will lead to prison overcrowding, making civilians living in the same dangerous life you tried to take them out of. We believe that Nayib Bukele is being inhumane and too extreme. We are not defending gang violence, like I said. We are just going against of the ways of how Nayib Bukele is trying to solve these problems. We're all humans at the end of the day, and rights should be earned. rights should not have to be earned, but to be born with it. Human rights doesn't mean that we ignore the consequences, but instead allow people to go through fair trials. Not everybody is a gang member. Therefore,
POI.
trials in court will allow. I'll take your POI later. Therefore, trials in court will allow a fair chance for the individual to be further checked and to find the truth. How would you feel walking the streets of El Salvador as an innocent civilian and suddenly you have your rights taken away just because you have the same tattoo or you live in the same area as these gang members? Human rights protect people from extreme inhumane treatment, such as what is going on in El Salvador prison right now. Removing human rights, criminals will see this as the consequence, become more inhumane, causing more crimes within the prison filled with civilians. The law of anti-gang measures has created fear and unrest among citizens. The tie-in with extra military support causes a lack of safety within the community. Military forces with guns being commonly seen in urban areas, neighborhoods, places where people should feel safe, but they don't because they constantly see these government having to keep an eye out and always having their guards on, even on innocent people. I'll take your POI now.
Okay, can you elaborate how your policy of reform will work under the setting of constant gang member? Do you think gang member will just stop because somehow reform of education that they could have had years ago will exist?
I'm sorry, your POI is unrelated to whatever I've been saying. So proposition, they then continue to say that it's okay to sacrifice even a few couple of innocent civilians just because, at the end of the day, you mass incarcerate the rest of the majority, right? But then what happens to these lives of these innocent civilians? A couple of innocent civilians' lives doesn't give you an excuse to incarcerate the rest, doesn't give you an excuse to be able to take away their human rights or take away it doesn't give you an excuse for your actions. Now I'll be moving on with my second argument, which is unchecked government power. Nayib Bukele's efforts to diminish gang violence have included state of exception, which basically means civilians are stripped of their rights. No need for warranties to check their houses. Civilians have no right to defense. No freedom of speech or association. Because of this, civilians have a lack of civil liberties, their rights to protect themselves from the government. No freedom of speech, no monetary freedom, no privacy, which is a basic human right that everybody is born with. Now, not a way to defend themselves, but something that we're all born with and have a right to ourselves. Tied in constant sense of being oppressed or silenced by the government. Government obviously abuses this power. So many El Salvadorian civilians have suffered from police brutality or military brutality because of a vast majority of another party that they have absolutely nothing to do with. When no one can question the government can do anything. This panel is obviously why we should stand firmly against the motion and find a different way to solve these problems, such as focus on the stability of economic growth. How to do that? When you focus on things such as more employment, more goods get produced, the economy grows, and everyone gets an equal payout, and poverty rates are reduced. Why is this important in the case panel? Because all these gang violence started with poverty in the first place. They weren't just born as gang members like that. They turned into one as a mechanism to work against poverty. Let's remember the basis of what unchecked government is, giving an individual the power to use their authority without any sense of accountability. We can clearly see what's been going on in the USA. The abuse of power made such measures backfire because it hurts and deeply affects the civilians instead of capturing the criminals. Panel, Nayib Bukele's measures are supporting the ease to abuse of power and using power against an innocent lives. These measures are just made to increase the corruption of government, such as using the government's resources for his own personal gain. Over time, this is going to turn into democracies, into authoritarian regimes. Now, understand that in this debate, unchecked government power is just as dangerous as gang violence. It changes law into permissions, but civilians into subjects. So with that, I've never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.
I thank the second speaker of opposition for the speech, responding to case, calling the third speaker of proposition.
I'll start my speech. I'll start my speech in 3, 2. 1. Why do we need to care about the gangs when the people who are suffering the most is the public that is under the control and influence of these gangs? We acknowledge that the gangs in poverty is important, but what we believe that the safety of the public is more important, and I'll prove why later in my speech. A few things I'd like to do is whip. First of all, point out a few flaws in their case, and second of all, going on to the clashes, right? First of all, they have a First of all, to point out, they have a burden to prove a counterfactual, but they haven't. Because their counterfactual is reform, which means that they're providing education because the root cause is poverty. However, this reform only exists under the premise that gang violence is absent. But this is not true because gang violence will still happen on their side. They never prove that gang members will have the incentive to stop when these reforms will happen. Second of going on to the clashes, right? Why is it more important to protect the public than to solve the root causes, even if it is true? Root causes like poverty, corruption, and inequality take 10 to 20 years to fix. Meanwhile, gangs are murdering and controlling neighborhoods today. You harm the innocent civilians who have nothing to do with this, and you harm other things, right? Removing gangs, we believe, also helps solve the problems. This looks like small businesses or corporations not able to function and work because gangs exist. Schools are going to shut down because it is unsafe for their students to go to school. Businesses will suffer, and businesses will suffer because no one wants to go outside and no one wants to buy things, and the city becomes unsafe. We believe when we do this, it creates the condition for the root problems to be fixed in the first place, which is how their counterfactual is going to work. If you're able to create the condition for the reforms to happen, then the reforms will happen. But if the companies and the schools are going to shut down, you aren't able to solve these root problems. But why does this also not fix problems? Because these gangs no longer have the incentive because they're in poverty, because they are control neighborhoods and influence politics. Even if poverty is solved, most likely it will not remove the gangs because they now function as a whole criminal institution and believes in psychological and ideological things like the KKK, and not just that they needed immediate finance, right? Even if it was true that their long-term policies will work, their model has no short-term solution, right? Even if they might have a long-term solution, in the best case that it works, they do not help the present people who are dying, the businesses being shut down, and the city being unsafe and politically falling in the first place. How on our side do we help the gang on proposition? You cannot rehabilitate people who are still trapped inside violent organizations because most gang members do not join voluntarily. It looks like little kids being forced to join a gang, or else they would face violence against them or their family, because a gang is only effective if they have many followers. If you arrest these gangs, then people will be forced to join, and secondly, they will have a better chance to disengage with the gangs because now they have less of a leader, and that they're able to get out of the gangs easier. So for those reasons, we're so proud to be Proposition. Thank you.
I thank the third speaker of proposition for the speech, calling the third speaker of oppositions to respond to the case.
My pronouns are he, him. I prefer verbal POIs. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Those who will give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Now, the debate is simple. Government stands here and tells you that security comes from stronger prisons, more soldiers, harsher punishments, and fewer riots. And they want you to believe that the only way to defeat gangs is to give the state more power and suspend freedoms in the name of safety, as if violence is simply as if violence will simply disappear once enough people are arrested and locked away. But the truth is so much more far deeper and far more dangerous than that. Crime is not just a problem of weak punishment. It grows out of poverty, broken communities, lack of opportunity, and a system that pushes young people toward gang violence because they see no other future. Now, when violence is treated only as a policing problem, the cause of the disease remains untouched, and the government ends up treating the symptoms while the infection continues spreading underneath. And that is exactly what the policies of Nayib Bukele do. Yes, thousands of people have been arrested, prisons are filling up, and the government proudly celebrates falling crime numbers. But what they do not show you is the cost. The moment a state begins suspending rights, removing protections like due process and freedom of assembly, and allowing mass arrests without proper investigation, it creates a system where innocent people are swept into prisons and entire communities begin to fear the government itself. Because once emergency powers are normalized, they rarely stay temporary. Power slowly expands, police begin arresting first and asking questions later. We tell you the military moves into deeper into civilian life, and citizens gradually are told that rights are luxuries they cannot afford. Over time, the fight against gangs stops being about justice and begins turning into something else entirely. A government that maintains order through fear rather than through law. Now, government will say this is necessary. They will say desperate problems require desperate measures. But history shows us something very clear. When states sacrifice human rights in the name of security, they rarely manage to keep both. Freedom disappears first, and eventually security begins to collapse as well. Now, government tells you that before anything else, the state must first gain authoritarian power because gangs supposedly control territory more strongly than the government. They say human rights are already bad in both worlds, but in our world, they claim fear and violations are worse because gangs dominate communities, and they openly admit they are willing to sacrifice innocent lives if it solves the larger problem. Now, let me take down the entire case in 5 layers of analysis. First, they claim the government must become more authoritarian because gangs control territory. Now think about what exactly does that mean. Their solution to gangs ruling through fear is for the state to rule through even greater fear. If gangs dominate people by force, intimidation, and arbitrary punishment, and the state responds by suspending rights and arresting thousands without due process, then the only thing that has changed is who is holding the gun. That is restoring order. That is not restoring order. That is copying the same logic gangs use. Second, they forget the one and only thing governments need to actually dismantle gangs, and that is cooperation from the communities. Now, police break criminal networks through witnesses, local information, and trust. But when innocent people are swept into prisons, when families see relatives detained without fair trials, those communities stop trusting the state. They stop talking to the police, they stop reporting crimes, and the government destroys the very relationship it needs to win the fight. Third, listen carefully to their moral logic. They openly say they are willing to sacrifice innocent lives for the bigger goal. That should terrify you, because the moment a system decides innocent people are acceptable collateral damage, there is no limit anymore. Today, it is suspected gang members. Tomorrow, it could be journalists, activists, or anyone the government decides is inconvenient. A state that accepts injustice as a tool stops being a protector and starts becoming another threat to its own citizens. Fourth, they try to compare fear and say our world is worse because gangs scare people. But ask yourself this: gangs create fear because they are criminals. Governments are supposed to create justice and protection. If the state starts using the same methods gangs use, then the fear does not disappear. It simply spreads everywhere because now citizens
POI.
must fear both criminals, I'll take it later, both criminals and the government. Finally, their entire strategy ignores the real reasons gangs exist. Poverty, broken communities, lack of opportunity, abandoned neighborhoods, where gangs become the only structure offering income and identity. You can arrest thousands today, but if those conditions remain, new recruits will keep replacing them tomorrow. You are not ending the system, you are just clearing space for the next generation of gangs. So look at what the model actually produces. Innocent people are sacrificed, communities distrust the government, and a state that grows more authoritarian every day. Now, in today's debate, I've spotted out three clashes. The first clash being security. Now, government tells you these policies are necessary because gangs created chaos and fear. They say harsher prisons, more military presence, and emergency powers are the only way to restore security. But let's actually think about what kind of security they are actually offering. Because when a government suspends human rights and arrests thousands of people without proper trials and allows the military to operate in every day in civilian life, that is not just fighting crime. That is normalizing unchecked power. And once the government learns that it can remove rights whenever it claims there is a crisis, and what stops it from doing it again? Today it is gangs. Tomorrow it could be political opponents, journalists, or even ordinary citizens who simply disagree with the government. Now, government wants you to believe that freedom must be sacrificed for safety. But history shows us that when states expand power in the name of security, they rarely give that power back. Now, the real question in the debate is not whether gangs are dangerous. Of course, they are. The question is whether we are willing to destroy the rule of law in order to fight them. Now, because a country where citizens fear the government as much as the criminals is not a safer country. It is simply a different kind of fear. The second clash is the short-term results. Government will proudly point to the falling crime statistics. They will say thousands of gang members are in prison, violence has dropped. The statistics alone do not prove policy is sustainable because gangs do not appear out of thin air. They grow in environments. They grow in environments of poverty, lack of opportunity, weak education, and abandoned communities. When young people see no path to stability, gangs become the only structure offering money, identity, and protection to the citizens. And mass arrests may remove current gang members, they do not remove the conditions that created them. If communities remain poor, neglected, and hopeless, new recruits will keep replacing the new ones sitting in prison. The cycle will simply repeat itself. The third clash is justice. Government claims these measures target criminals. But when emergency powers allow mass arrest with limited due process, the reality becomes far more dangerous because when thousands of people are detained quickly, mistakes are inevitable. Innocent people get swept into the system. Families lose fathers, brothers, and sons without clear evidence of fair trials. And when communities see innocent people taken away without justice, trust in the legal system begins to collapse. When people stop believing the justice system is fair, they stop cooperating with it. They stop reporting crimes, they stop trusting the police, and once that trust disappears, long-term stability disappears with it. Now, gang rule through fear, and when the state begins to rule in the same way, the people have not been liberated. They have only changed who they are afraid of. So side beside opposition. Thank you very much.
I think the third speaker of opposition for the speech to summarize the debate come from oppositions, calling opposition reply speaker.
Hello, hello. Yes, am I visible and audible once again?
Yes, you are.
Alright. So I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, throughout this debate, side proposition have been extremely fallacious. They have been looking at this debate from one perspective, whether Bukele's measures are the way, and as our side which has no action being taken. That is what the proposition are saying. But the reality is, Bukele's measures are not the only way to solve the problem, and they're definitely not the best way either. There's another way, and we've already mentioned it time and time again. We are saying that we should solve it from the root of the problem. Now, the problem is this debate is not whether we should arrest these criminals, but rather his policies. We should definitely arrest some of these criminals, but that doesn't mean that his policies are acceptable. Arresting people without any fair reason, that is not fair. That is not the right policy. Rather, the government should do things in a more legal way, in a more human rights perspective. Now, something that proposition has brought up is the incentive for people to stop in our world. Now, let me elaborate the incentive to stop. First of all, even they have already agreed that people are forced to join these gangs. The reason people are forced to join these gangs are because gangs have less people and because they need more people to fight against the government because the government is not catering to the people's needs. So, here is the question of this debate. If the problem from the root cause was solved, would gangs need to exist in the first place? In that case, would there be gangs in countries like Norway, Finland, or Sweden, which are already very peaceful? In those countries, you can see that there is stability. And the reason for that is because their people are living happy lives. Now, That is the incentive for gangs to stop if we have a strong base. Now, gangs are not born, people are not born into gangs, they are forged into gangs. These gangs are caused from a root cause, the root cause being things like poverty, as said earlier. And let me take you into an example, a bit of an extreme example, but let's look at Nazi Germany. So, around the 1920s, Germany had the Great Depression to endure. The people were in violence. There was so much gang violence in the States. And then in the 1933, Adolf Hitler comes to power. And Adolf Hitler implements policies that go to hunt down, crack down on these criminals. And what happens? The country becomes more peaceful. Statistically, it becomes more peaceful. However, look deeper down. The people were not happier. The people were not in that same shape. First of all, the people were still rationing even during that time. Why? Because they're still trying to be corrupt. The Nazi government was still being corrupt. And even though they tried to exterminate all this crime, the fact of the matter is the crackdown on crime did not help the people of his country at the time. Just because it became safer for the people because there's no crime, doesn't mean that the bigger criminals, the government in that case, in Nazi Germany, would not be the ones. Because the government in their case was the biggest problem for their country. Now, where does this tie down? El Salvador, military government. Their government taking a full military crackdown on the people who are involved in crime. So let's look a bit at linking this together. If we link what El Salvador and we look at Nazi Germany as well, we can see that El Salvador is first of all going into a military state trying to solve these crimes. And they're doing this in a very aggressive manner. And what we can see is through this, while they may be solving crime in an immediate way, they are not solving the long-term issue. Still, gangs will still come popping up and popping up and popping up. Why is this the case? Because just because you arrest these gang members doesn't mean that the resentment in the people will not leave. The resentment will still stay, panel. The reason for this is because the people, they have rights to live. If their rights are being taken away, why would they want to listen to the government? They will be living in fear, panel. And living in fear is not living in productivity. The government should cater to the people's needs. That does not mean that the government should hunt down people with illegal ways, injustifiable ways, by removing the human rights of the people of El Salvador. Which is why, panel, we strongly oppose and reject this motion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, opposition reply speaker, for the speech. Now to end the entire debate, calling government reply speaker.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. My speech will start in 3, 2, and 1. I don't think El Salvador is USA. Judge, I don't remember ordering a cappuccino, but that's exactly what we got from opposition's lovely bartenders. A lot of talking, but very little explanation of how their world actually stops gangs from harming citizens. Firstly, why the random arrests they mentioned in their case today are very unlikely and overstated, right? I think opposition claims that government will randomly arrest random citizens, but we think that this doesn't happen for 3 reasons. Firstly, we believe law enforcement still relies on indicators and intelligence. Even under emergency anti-gang policies, arrests are not completely arbitrary. Authorities will be able to rely on investigations, intelligence network, and documented reports and gang-related indicators to identify these suspected members. This means enforcement is still targeted towards individuals connected to gang activity rather than random civilians. But secondly, we say that random arrests would undermine the government's own goals. The purpose of the policy is to restore this public trust and dismantle gangs. We think that randomly arresting innocent civilians would immediately destroy this public legitimacy and make cooperation from communities impossible. This is why we say this is a move that governments are not likely to make. Thirdly, we say that opposition exaggerates the scale by a very large depth, because they assume that large numbers of innocent people would be arrested, but they never prove why the outcome would occur at a systematic level. At much, there may be isolated mistakes, which can happen in any law enforcement system, but isolated areas are very different from those systematic random arrests that they describe, panel. We think that they claim they saw solve the root causes of gang violence, such as poverty and broken communities. We think in reality, those policies cannot work for several reasons. Our side actually creates the conditions where those solutions becomes possible. Because A, security is a prerequisite for reform. Social programs, education, and economic development require teachers, businesses, and government workers to safely operate in communities. We think when gangs dominate neighborhood, they extort businesses and recruit youth. That means that development programs cannot even reach the people they are meant to help. We think that by dismantling gang power and restoring the state authority, our policy reopens the space for schools and jobs and social programs to function in the first place. We are the prerequisite to their case, panel. And so in other words, we do not ignore the root causes. We make it possible to address them in the first place. But secondly, we believe that breaking gangs stops the cycle that produces those root causes. Why is this so? We believe that gang domination destroys local economies and forces businesses to close. Once gangs are weakened, businesses can reopen and employment increase. That directly addresses the economic and social conditions that opposition talks about. We have more immediate impacts. But then thirdly, we see our solution is more feasible. We see that they assume the government can implement social programs immediately, but they ignore the fact that gangs will interfere, capture resources, or threaten participants. In their world, reforms fail because gangs remain powerful, right? Let me just respond to opposition real quick on their five-layer extension that just came out as late material from WHIP. Firstly, we see that structural causes do not justify allowing violence to continue. Gangs are simply not groups of poor individuals trying to survive. They're organized connections that extort businesses and threaten civilians. We say that structural goals may explain why gangs exist, but they do not remove the state's responsibility to stop the harm that those gangs are currently causing. Secondly, we say that they ignore the power structure of gangs. We say that they still maintain the territorial control and conserve power. They can still force young people to join and threaten families, even if economic support exists. Gangs can continue to control communities and recruit members. We directly weaken the power structure that allows gangs to dominate society, panel. But thirdly, their corruption claim is very speculative. More importantly, we believe that corruption exists in any government policies, including the subsidies and the social programs that they propose. But fourthly, their rights argument misunderstands how rights actually work. They see that rights exist to protect citizens from government power. We believe that principle is true in normal circumstances, but it assumes that the state actually controls society. People cannot exercise their basic rights by reporting crimes and running businesses freely, because in other words, gang rule is already destroying the practical ability of citizens to enjoy their rights, which means that restoring the state authority is necessary before those rights can meaningfully exist again. Proud to propose.